Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here, joined today by James Rhyu, who's the CEO of Stride, also known in the field as K12. We're going to talk about a lot of the really interesting work that he's doing, an organization that's been around 25 years, so some interesting perspective there. James, welcome to Trending in Education.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you, and congratulations to K12. 25 years is a long stretch of time. We'll get into what you're doing at K12 next, but before we do that, we always like to start by getting to know you a little bit better, your origin story, your background as a learning professional. How'd you get to this point in your professional life?
I never really imagined that I was going to be the CEO of a company like this. I started out in accounting, and not that many accountants get the privilege of running a multi-billion-dollar public company. And it's been a real privilege, the journey I've taken, and so I really came up through the accounting ranks and then in finance, and I was a CFO. I had great passion for that. I loved it. It's great grounding and background in almost any field of business, I think. Gives you a really good understanding about sort of the mechanics of how I think companies work.
Yeah.
And I was in a personal situation actually where my dad at the time, who was living in the area where K12 is based, he was diagnosed with dementia. My brother and I was in the area. We wanted to, come and sort of be close to him at that time. And I was living in Texas, and I just really fortuitously got a call about the CFO job here from the then CEO, who was also an old boss of mine.
Uh-huh.
And, I really hadn't thought about the education space. I hadn't been in the education space really. I always joked I wasn't even ever a great student. Education really wasn't my thing. And I've been here now, I guess I'm in my 13th year. And over that time, I've learned so much about the education space, a lot of great things, some not so great things, by the way, about the education space in our country. But I've really come to appreciate, I think, the needs of families around education. And I think that, to me, a lot of what K12 has stood for the past 25 years, and what I hope we stand for even more over the next 25 years, is really catering to the needs of the families that need something that may be a little bit different than what's offered in their backyard. Because that, for most families, that is the only choice they have, right? It's
Right.
the school that's sitting in their backyard. Unfortunately, that's not the best fit for every child and every family.
Right.
Of course, I think we all wish it was, but I think practically it's probably not. I mean, it's no different than, you may have a local store that doesn't carry the exact things that you want to buy or whatever, and so you go further afield to buy that.
Yeah. Or you go to Amazon. Yeah.
Exactly. And that, that's actually a lot of the genesis of this company is really that type of model where you're giving families a little bit more optionality about essentially, where and what to buy, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's where maybe getting into K12 and its origins is really interesting as well. When you do look at that 25-year perspective, Prince would be very happy telling us to party like it's 1999, but that's quite a while ago. And at the same time, I think it's almost we're in a retro window for the 90s now, where 90s is back in, surprisingly, as my 5-year-old is very much into MC Hammer for whatever reason. But it does seem like that span of time, got to be a lot of institutional knowledge, but also some perhaps flexibility, adaptability to continue to kind of transform yourself to stay relevant as the world continues to get more and more complex.
Yeah. And, I think the last statement you made is almost the most relevant in that the world has gotten so much more complex.
Yeah.
In some really great ways, I think, and in some challenging ways. And if you look at, just give you a very, very simplistic statistic. When I was going to school in K-12 school, compared to now, which was 40 plus years ago, the percentage of kids who were classified as, special needs kids 40 years ago versus today, it's double. Okay. And part of that is, I think, the complex sort of world we live in. A lot of that's, some great healthcare that we've been able to provide and diagnose better.
Yeah. Better awareness, better
awareness, better parental awareness. I think a lot of very positive things. But the reality is when you have that kind of a trend, your local public school system isn't always equipped
Yep.
to deal with the broad range and diversity
Hmm.
of special needs that a lot of children have.
Yeah.
And also, unfortunately, most families in this country aren't financially equipped to solve that need
Hmm.
with, a fancy private school or,
Right.
extra tutoring or, things like that. Most families in this country can't. And so as the complexity of the family dynamic evolves, of the educational needs in that evolve, I think what we've been able to do at K12 is provide for many of those families one alternative. And that's one alternative, by the way, out of many alternatives. And what I hope ultimately will be many more alternatives
Yeah.
that allow families to do just as we opened with, like, instead of going to the local supermarket,
Right.
they could shop a little further afield if they wanted to. They could shop online if they wanted to. The choices that they have to shop online are not just Amazon, but other places,
Yeah.
specialty companies online, specialty stores offline,
Sure.
and so I think that just that capability really for the consumer. And, we talk about shopping like Amazon shopping, but, that's also applies to most facets of whether it's banking or
Right.
healthcare, retail. 40 years ago, most of those options were relegated to a small geographic area, right?
Yep. Yep.
25 years ago, it started to shift in most aspects of consumers' lives. And it just so happens, I think in education, it shifted slower.
Yeah. Hmm. But the shift is increasingly online. How are families getting access to this? Is it from the individual family's perspective or is it from the schools? How does the market side of the equation work?
Yeah. So for most of our 25 years leading up to the pandemic, it was largely us working with our partners. We manage programs for our partners. Some of those are school districts, some of those are not-for-profit charter school institutions.
Yep.
But whoever our partner is, we're managing the program for them. And for most of our, first 25 years, we were trying to deal directly with the consumer in terms of getting them to come to one of these programs that
I
best
see.
suited their needs, right?
Hmm.
Now, the pandemic changed the equation a little bit on everybody. And, pre-pandemic, just the awareness of like a full-time virtual online program for most families was actually a little bit unknown.
Yep.
Awareness is pretty low,
Hmm.
10, 15%. And not only was awareness low, but there was a little bit of stigma
Yep.
online learning. And I know, fortunately or unfortunately, I have a little bit of a background. I used to work at Match.com selling
Right.
the online dating space. And I worked there when
Hmm.
online dating also had a stigma to it.
Right. Those
And
days are gone though, James. Yeah,
but
for
those
sure.
days are long gone, right? And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I was very fortunate because I worked at Match when we spawned the app Tinder.
Hmm.
And Tinder was one of the real turning points in online dating that helped propel online dating from sort of a niche, stigmatized social activity into a really much more mainstream activity,
Yep.
right? And, since I've left there, we just seen
Yeah.
that category really explode. And now if you talk to young people or older people, I mean, of any age really, the dating population, they wouldn't think twice about online dating.
Hmm.
And I think that online education, particularly K through 12 space, is going through a sort of a similar evolution where
Hmm.
it was previously stigmatized, I think, a fair bit.
Yeah.
I think
Hmm.
the pandemic triggered a little bit of a release from both the lack of awareness as well as maybe the stigma.
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, for many, the experience in online learning during the pandemic wasn't great.
Yeah. There was a
At least
backlash there. Yeah.
there was a little bit, but at least I think it provided some awareness. And while there were a lot of families who really suffered during the pandemic,
Right.
some families that opened their eyes to ways it can actually help enrich their children.
Yep. Yep. Hmm.
And while that maybe it probably was the minority of families,
Right.
it still was a significant number of families.
Right. I mean, it's also just the awareness of a category.
Exactly.
Like that was
Exactly.
the transformation that happened where suddenly, even if the kid's Zoom room wasn't great, also, I think, to its credit, the Zoom experiences of the early pandemic was a relatively high floor technically. Like you
Yeah.
could see things break a lot more. It was
Yes.
more on the human side. I think not only were the teachers were going through trauma themselves, but then they also weren't necessarily trained in leading this type of stuff.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I think there's a little bit maybe of a misperception in the public around what happened in the pandemic. And, people are criticizing teachers and things like that. And, listen, that the pandemic caught us all by surprise.
Yep.
And it caught us sort of for the school year, caught us midstream. And teachers, as you said, they were going through their own
Right.
issues. And
Mhm.
we have to remember that they had their own families and they had their own situations that they were dealing with at the same time. At the same time, they were trying to do their jobs and educate kids, right?
Right.
And the districts at that time weren't well equipped to even train the teachers properly
Right. Mhm.
because it took them by surprise as well, right? So
Yep.
I think, it's always easy to point the finger and complain and, be negative. And I do think many of the experiences were negative and left a bad taste in many families' mouths. But, listen, the districts and school leaders and particularly teachers, they were doing the best they could under the circumstances that they had.
Yeah.
And I really want to give a shout out to the nation's teachers because I think, they have gone underappreciated for so long. But
Yeah.
also, I think during the pandemic, they were criticized unfairly in many
Yeah.
cases.
Mhm.
And I think, the teachers in this country, I mean, they're part of the backbone of the country. And I think we really have to
Mhm.
recognize and appreciate that. But I do think that that pandemic, as you said, it created a greater awareness around online learning.
Yeah.
And even if it wasn't a great experience, I think a lot of families found out that some of their kids thrived in that environment. It gave them a certain degree of
Yeah.
flexibility, maybe. It
Right.
may have helped address a certain need,
Right.
safety, social
Mhm.
issues, whatever they were that that
Mhm.
family was dealing with, that the child was dealing with. Some of them realized that, hey, this actually helps kids.
Right. And it's the whole promise of personalization, which is very much, I think, central to the work you're doing at Stride and
That's
K12
right.
is like, every learner should have some individualized awareness from the system that is powering their kind of learning experiences. This is
Exactly.
something, having been around 25 years and, I was even working in the space right through that span of time. And there was always talk of this kind of holy grail of personalization. Now the technology is advancing such that it's more realizable. And, in the case of AI, the advent of ChatGPT, suddenly that was widely available to a
Yes.
level that people, weren't expecting. Perhaps, after being caught off guard by the pandemic, we were then caught off guard by a little bit of breakthrough technology. As someone who's at the helm of a really big entity in K-12 education, navigating that must have been complex and must continue to be complex. Although I have heard from folks acting as though AI just started to enter the space when ChatGPT hit is a little bit short-sighted because
That's right.
a lot of the stuff that is powering these systems is already leveraging machine learning and predictive analytics and all these other things. Thoughts about the technology side and how it almost, built on some of the stuff you were talking about around the pandemic. It does feel like this new technology wave is really rippling through education, and it's something we're all kind of reckoning with.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like you said, a lot of the elements of that I think the public is considering AI today have actually been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
Machine learning algorithms have been around. I think that sort of the some of the breakthroughs really have been with these companies like ChatGPT and the other big technology companies that have now put together these and leveraging and harnessing that sort of super data set, if you will, against these large language models. And there's a little bit of a double-edged sword here, I think, when ChatGPT made the big splash, 18, 20 months ago, and everybody wanted to jump on the bandwagon and be like, "Oh yeah, we're an AI company now. Oh,
Yeah.
we're," and I think a lot of people realize that it's not that easy, the application of AI for specific types of industries,
Yeah.
particularly in education and particularly K through 12 education. I think our approach is we want to be very careful because you may have heard like about hallucinations and things like that. But
Yeah.
also to generically say the error rate within ChatGPT and K through 12 education right now is probably a little too high
Yep.
for what I think we would want to entrust with our K through 12 educated children, right?
Yeah. Right.
That doesn't mean, by the way, that's not a great technology and that it's going to propel a lot of industries forward. And I think it actually still has a lot of capabilities within the education industry. I just think
Yeah.
we have to be a little bit more careful
Right.
about how we generically apply it to education, because
Mhm.
we're talking about like learning here for our kids.
Right.
And when
Right.
you have, a 20% error rate
Right.
and your kids are learning, one out of every five things wrong,
Right.
well,
Right.
that's, you got to be really careful there.
Mhm.
So I think, a lot of companies, particularly even in the education space, they just came out with these public announcements of, hey, we've got this great new AI product. And we were very careful to publicly say, we don't have an announcement,
Yeah.
because we want to make sure that we're understanding this better. And we want to
Yeah.
make sure that we get it right. And so
Mhm.
we may not be as splashy as some of these other companies that are out there talking about AI. We are working in the background. And you may have heard now a lot of companies more talking about like small language models as opposed to
Yep.
large language models, hybrid models, leveraging
Mhm.
proprietary data more. And
Yep.
because we have access to the largest content library, digital content library in the US, we have online proprietary data, learning data,
Learning data. Mhm.
right? And we can leverage some of that to build some of these small language models to
Yep.
help really provide some of that personalized learning. Now,
Mhm.
I'm not going to announce anything today, but I think we're sort of getting closer and closer to the point where there are things that we're going to be able to really leverage in the AI space that's really innovative, that does get us close to that personalized learning. To give you sort of a framework example, it incorporates a little bit of a different way that we want to think about personalized learning, which is sort of as follows. In the morning, let's say a child logs on and the child is in sixth grade and logging onto their computer. And the first thing the computer does is it says, "Oh, good morning, Michael.
Yeah.
How are you feeling today?"
Mhm.
What sixth grader doesn't want to at least get some little personal attention in that way, right?
Mhm. Yep.
And if the child responds, "Oh, I'm feeling a little bit tired," the computer says, "Oh, well, why are you feeling so tired?" And
Right.
well, I was at a basketball game late last night and I didn't get enough sleep because I had to come home and do my homework or whatever.
Right.
And I think you say, "Oh, well, you know what? Why don't we pause? Why don't you watch this 2-minute video, do a little bit of stretching, stand up, get your blood circulating a little bit, and that's going to help get you ready for
Right.
your lesson." Right
Mhm.
now, a teacher in a classroom normally can't do that because they can't have 3 kids over here doing
Right.
stretching exercises and 2 kids over here doing jump, like
Yeah.
create chaos in the classroom, right? But if you're in an online learning environment,
Yeah.
right, you can probably do that more effectively,
Mhm.
catered, personalized, right?
Yeah.
And we haven't started teaching or learning yet, but this is just more getting the kid to feel like, I'll say, somebody cares,
Sure.
have a
Yeah.
feeling they're asking about them. And then we can move into the lesson, say, okay, well, Michael, yesterday you left off in unit 6 of your math lesson,
Mhm.
but you struggled.
Right.
So for you, we're going to review unit 6 again. We want to
Yeah.
make sure that you've gotten it. And so we're going to ask you to play this little game.
Yeah.
And it's a game-based learning little module that's going to help reinforce those topics that we
Right.
learned about.
And it probably even knows that I like that kind of game. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and by the way, another student, Sally, she may have completed unit 6 and she did it perfectly fine. We're going to move on to unit 7.
Yeah. Sally.
And Sally, by the way, she's an advanced learner and she quickly gets to unit 7, gets to unit 8.
Yeah.
Now,
Right.
here's the interesting where AI, I think, can really come into play, or machine learning can really come into play. The teacher might have a dashboard, and that dashboard may be to identify where that teacher needs to
Yeah.
intervene.
Mhm.
Now, historically, intervention has been thought about when kids are behind. So
Right.
Michael's a little bit behind,
Yeah.
intervention needed. But what we can now determine is that actually maybe Michael learns at a certain pace.
Yeah.
It's not that he's incapable of learning or is actually requiring intervention.
Yeah.
Maybe that Michael just requires a little bit more time, maybe extra video help, maybe extra practice help to
Yeah.
really master.
I'm kind of a kinesthetic learner, so I might need to interpret some dance into my learning experience. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right. And by the way, there are, like, in the game-based learning type stuff. So maybe you are that way, and maybe you're going to learn through some, whatever, some movement exercise that's going to help,
Yeah.
you put the context of those mathematical things in perspective for you, right?
Sure.
So every learner is going to be different that way. But the point is that I think historically we've been conditioned to think that slower learners require intervention,
Yeah.
when actually they just may require a certain trajectory of learning.
Right. And it's
And
almost a level of depth to the lesson planning and the individualization of the IEP. I've heard folks talk
yes,
about AI enabling more of like an IEP for everyone kind of sensibility where, it's been something that's been scarce and we may have technical breakthroughs that allow us to kind of flip things that were scarce to actually make them more abundant, which then can kind of help us reimagine how all this stuff works.
that's right. And two things. One is, I think IEP often has this connotation that it's somewhat negative.
Yes.
You know what I mean? But I actually think we flip it on its head and be like, it's actually a positive thing that we
Yes.
can give you an individualized plan,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so I think we've got to also flip the context of what that is on its head. But
Right.
also, I think for the teacher, let's not forget, AI is not going to displace teaching necessarily, or teachers. I
Yeah.
think it's going to augment and help them.
Hmm.
But the teacher also, I mentioned the dashboard, but the other facet of teaching that I think is really burdensome that AI can help alleviate with is what you mentioned earlier, which is the lesson planning, right? Because
Yeah.
in
Right.
every state, as you may know, there's a different set of standards. And, until I came to this company, I never realized it. It really struck me. When you're in grade school, okay, I don't know if you remember, at least for me, sometimes you walk into a classroom first day and the teacher said, okay, open your textbook to chapter 3. And you're sure like, well, what about chapters 1 and 2?
Right. Yeah.
And then you might go from chapter 3 to chapter 7, by the way.
Yeah. Hopping
It
around.
wasn't always sequential, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
part of the reason I now understand and realize is that because state standards
Mm.
are often different, okay?
Yeah.
And so the sequencing, the scoping of a state standard A may be different than state standard B. And so
Yeah.
the teachers required, because, textbooks tend to be, I'll say, generic, they're one size fits all.
Yep.
So the teachers are then required to map
Hmm.
the book to the set of standards so that they can teach according to their state standards. That's a pretty heavy administrative burden for teachers.
Yep.
Now we can apply AI to help those teachers automatically create that scope and sequence of planning,
Yeah.
right? And so I think the technology and the innovation that we can apply really, it's not just about the learning side of it. It's also, I think, a lot of great tools that we can help the teachers be more effective and
Yeah.
focus more on the teaching than the
Hmm.
administration. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I really think the technology, but we're sort of maybe at this sort of tipping point, right? Where the technology is at a point that if we apply them effectively, it's not just helping improve the learning, but it's actually helping improve the overall, I'll say, school environment, if you will, which would
Yeah.
include teaching. By the way, also could include socialization in the
Right.
classroom. It could also
Hmm.
include socialization in online learning. Yeah, there's a lot of aspects to it, to the technologies today that I think can help improve the overall environment, not
Yeah.
just the personalized learning, but would include the personalized learning.
Yeah. It is interesting too, in that part of the challenge of the pandemic was, everyone was thrown into the deep end of the pool to figure out who was going to thrive versus not. It does feel like at least the early stages of the AI hype cycle may have pushed more schools into, I need to do something with AI, even though I don't know what problems it's going to solve. Again, I think it's smart to think about the teacher as kind of the front end. I've heard of AI as being behind the teacher.
Yeah.
I've talked about centaurs before, blending of humans with AI. And I think Cory Doctorow was recently talking about how you want to make sure the human is the front part of the centaur as opposed to the other. Like a horse's head, human's body doesn't quite work. So
Yeah.
you got to think through almost like the emotional design of this stuff to make sure it actually reaches people in the right way. And you're not designing something that is risky or actually detrimental
Yeah. And
to learning.
I would almost frame it a slightly different way. And I go back to sort of by analogy, online shopping, in that I don't think there's a design we should be rushing towards.
Right.
I think that there's sort of a spectrum, a continuum of opportunities and choices that we should allow families to be able to make.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, by the way, sometimes I happen to enjoy shopping at some stores. Like, yeah, I know I can get
Right.
some of those things online,
Yeah. Yeah.
but particularly like
Yeah.
produce and stuff like that. When I
Yeah.
do shopping, like I want to
Yeah.
touch and feel the apple and make sure it's whatever
You get out of
firmness
the
or
house,
whatever. Yeah,
maybe there's a podcast time to listen. I don't know. Yeah.
exactly. That's for me, by the way, right?
Mhm.
But I think a lot of people, they just prefer the convenience
Mhm.
of the online shopping, and so
Yeah.
they'll take some of the risk, if you will, of getting a bruised apple. If
Right.
they understand that,
Right.
and they understand that there's a downside to it. And I think some of the better vendors, they offer return. I don't know about for apples, they offer the return capability and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Sure.
so I think really what I would envision is just thinking about those families as customers. And I
Mhm.
think actually one of
Yeah.
the pitfalls that we've fallen into a little bit in our K-12 education system is we've lost sight a little bit of the fact that there's a customer there.
Yeah.
And that customer is probably going to want some options and choices.
Yeah.
And I think in the education system, often we're trying to tell the customer what's best for them, as opposed
Right.
to sometimes listening to what the
Yeah.
customer thinks
Mhm.
is best for the customer.
Mhm.
And, some people are like, oh, well, you can't compare it to shopping because, but what about healthcare? I mean, healthcare
Sure.
is just as important to, I think as education, it's health is important, right?
Yeah.
In the same way, I think we're increasingly learning that second opinions are good, by the way.
Right.
Having a choice of what kind of a doctor you want to go to. Like some doctors, just their bedside manner may be better for you than a different doctor.
Right.
So part of the overall healthcare isn't just about the medicine you're prescribed, but it's sort of the overall care you're getting.
Yeah.
Right? The dialogue you have with the doctor or physician,
Mhm.
being able to get a second opinion or a third opinion, right?
Right. Right.
And so I think education sort of needs to migrate in the same direction where we also have to listen to and by the way, I think in the healthcare example, customers want that optionality, that choice, the
Yeah.
whatever, but also customers are getting more educated. Customers are able to do some of their own research. They're able to, go online and understand some of these conditions a little bit better. And so
Yeah.
therefore maybe and say, okay, well, actually philosophically, I believe in these types of things. So I want to go to this type of doctor. Right.
Right.
And in education, similarly, we shouldn't discount families, not just respect their choices, but also discount the fact that they understand maybe what's best for their child or what's best for their situation.
Yeah.
And I think we need to respect the fact that maybe because they understand what's best for their situation, we should be listening to them
Yeah.
and treating them like customers
Mhm.
and listening to them like customers and
Yeah.
adapting our frameworks and our options for them in that way. And so, I think, again, if you sort of just take the analogy of other industries that have evolved over the past 25 years, I
Right.
think K through 12 education needs to similarly evolve.
Yeah.
And if I could just make one other point around that, which is we have in a lot of industries evolved to a little bit more of an outcome focus. And I don't say that in terms of like in education, say like getting more A's, if you will. Outcome in terms of what's the outcome that's best suited for the customer. So if you took like financial services in general, right? The best outcome isn't always the highest return.
Right.
The best outcome is sometimes just steady low return.
Mhm.
Sometimes the best outcome is cash flow. Sometimes,
Right.
right? So you have these outcomes that like aren't predetermined by some, I'll say, big brother watching entity, right? It's determined by what's the outcome that the customer believes is best for them and most appropriate for them, including how much risk they're willing to take, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, I think in education, right, we have to think about what outcome is most appropriate for the family. And in some cases, and I think increasingly so, the outcome is about workplace skills.
Yeah.
That's what's most appropriate for the family. Getting
Mm.
straight A's isn't actually what's most appropriate for that family.
Right. Right.
I think what happens is a lot of people who have always gotten straight A's think that everybody should be getting straight A's as the outcome that's most appropriate for them.
Right. Right.
But if you're, in a certain type of family situation, it may be that there's an economic outcome that's actually more important than straight A's.
Yep.
And
Mhm.
those skills,
Mhm.
your economic outcome is actually more
Yep.
relevant.
Mhm.
And so I think we also have to be thinking about that customer, about maybe what's most relevant for them educationally.
Yeah.
And that may be career and skills training as opposed to, getting an A in history. And so I think that's why like really listening and maybe a little self-promotion, but we run a lot of these career focused programs,
Right.
but we do that because it's what the customer has told us
Right.
is relevant to them. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
it wasn't just like a blind foray into something new.
Sure.
It's really trying to listen to what that customer wants.
Mhm.
And part of that customer base, by the way, is the employer side too,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. The higher level breakthrough you're talking about, which is what I would call like design thinking or
Mhm.
modern sort of product thinking, which is kind of a breakthrough of the 21st century. It hasn't reached all sectors at the same pace. And K-12 in particular is a place where the adoption of that mindset is gradual, and I think folks need organizations with some track record and also some awareness of the complexity of implementation, where it does vary depending
Absolutely.
on the school or the parent or the individual customer. And that's where I think that obsession with the customer and more of a focus on listening to the customer in service of making the product experience better, that's a breakthrough that I think has been slower to break through in the educational spaces and probably in K-12 in particular. Now, looking ahead, you have a unique vantage point, I think, leading the organization that you're in, also with the lens that you can apply based on your experience in other industries, the Match.com thing, and my wheels are still turning on that front. But if you were to look big picture, maybe even short, medium, and long term looking ahead, what do you see on the horizon? What are the things that get you excited? And then what are some of the things that maybe we need to be aware of on the risk side?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing for me really has to do with innovation because, so we talked a lot about the customer and listening to the customer. And I think generally speaking, customers, they may not put these words around it, but they want their experience to get better.
Mhm.
And generally speaking, they want their experience to get better through innovation. Again, they may not use those exact words,
Mhm.
but we hear over and over again customers that want the experience to be better.
Mhm.
We happen to have in our programs over the past couple of years, an NPS score, a net promoter score, well north of 50, which, ranks with some of the top brands,
Yeah.
in the world. And I think part of that is because we're really trying to listen to that customer. And I think so the breakthrough in innovations over the next 25 years, I think in the short term, they're really going to have to do, I hope at least, particularly in K through 12 education, I hope is evolving the service offering, if you will,
Mhm.
to incorporate more things that the customers want.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay. Now, that may be something as simple as a little more flexibility.
Yep.
It may not even have to do with a huge technological breakthrough,
Sure. Yep.
but it may offer just a little more flexibility. Maybe it's the flexibility to have kids do, part-time in classroom. And then we used to have this thing when I was in school called VOTech. And
Yeah.
kids in the afternoon, they would actually, from my school district, like, they would take a bus and they would go to like a vocational technical institute
Yeah.
and they would learn, machining and auto
Yeah.
repair and things like that. Okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
and a skill basically, right? And so,
Yeah.
maybe the flexibility we need is more of that type of thinking,
Hmm.
almost a blast to the past of the 90s, as you talked about earlier. So I think that in the short term, it's maybe just listening to that customer a little bit more, finding ways to innovate around what that customer wants. In the medium term, I do think it's going to involve more technology. I think one of the real positive things that came out of the pandemic was the government helped put a lot more computers in kids' hands.
Yep.
And it sort of even the playing field a little bit,
Yeah.
because unfortunately, maybe some underserved districts maybe didn't have the funding to do that as easily. And I think they were afforded that ability. So I think
Yeah.
that sort of in the medium term is really continuing to listen to the customer, but also leaning into some of those technologies more. I do think it's going to take a little while for AI to really, get some roots into the system and
Hmm.
spread throughout the systems. But I think we have to at least start down the path of training the teachers,
Yeah.
right? Because the technologies, you want some level of parity in knowledge, right? Between the teachers and the kids. Kids sort of
Yeah.
in technology, they're sort of racing ahead, right?
Right.
And you don't want it to be so that the kids are racing so far ahead from a technological perspective and the
Yeah.
teachers are getting left behind,
Right.
even though from a subject matter perspective, they're far ahead.
Sure.
You sort of can create a little bit of disharmony. So I think in the
Yeah.
medium term, what we want to do is we want to embrace some of these technologies, but also we want to be sure that we're arming the teachers with the right training and skills.
Yeah. And on that front, it does bring in a lot of ideas around media literacy,
Yes,
TikTok and like all of the algorithms that are powering the previous generation of technology. There's a lot of training of humans to understand that better and kind of protect
absolutely.
against adverse impacts in that space. But then also to your previous point about individualization, there are probably some ways to optimize some of these formats in service of learning. Increasingly, people are talking to me about how they use TikTok to learn. And as educators, that's a
Well,
bridge too far for the majority of
I'll
folks.
give you a perfect example. Forget about TikTok as a social media platform for a second.
Yeah.
Short format videos
Yes.
are the way that kids are consuming information. Okay. So I think we do need to learn. And again, listening to the customer and observing what the customer's doing and their behaviors, right? We do need to learn that short form video is probably increasingly, and you talk about short, medium, and long term, in the short and medium term, increasingly needs to become a format that we're providing kids to help them learn.
Yeah.
The same with gaming, right?
Yes.
Kids learn in
Yes.
games a lot, right?
Yep.
And you've heard in education a lot about game-based learning, but you don't really see it. You don't really see it in action as much as you maybe hear about it. Okay.
Right.
But I do think there are ways to introduce more game-based learning into the ecosystem,
Yeah.
because short form video and gaming are the way that kids are now accustomed to
Yeah.
consuming content and interacting.
Yeah. And learning. The
And learn,
level of
right.
learning that's involved in some of these games is off the charts. It's just not they're not necessarily learning what we want, although they honestly may be learning skills that could become increasingly relevant depending on
Exactly right.
what the future of work looks like. It's been an amazing conversation. We've hit a lot of interesting topics so far. I'm here with James Rhyu, who's the CEO of Stride Education, and folks may be familiar with K12 out in the K12 space. If you were to give folks advice, James, based on your experience, understanding maybe lessons in leadership or lessons in career growth, any words of advice or suggestions to our listeners out there, things that have been useful along your journey?
So there's two things that everybody always says, which is pursue something that you really enjoy doing
Mhm.
and be willing to take some risk, right?
Yeah.
So I would echo those two. I would add a third
Mhm.
one though, that I think maybe gets less headlines, but I think is just as important. I have a 19-year-old son, and so I'm sort of in active conversations with him along these lines is planning.
Yeah.
And plans can change and evolve, but I do think it's important to think ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
What's it look like for you in 5 years and
Mhm.
why?
Mhm.
And question the why. But what's it look like for you in 5 years and 10 years?
Mm.
And what can you do today to put yourself on that trajectory realistically to achieve goals in 5 years? Now, some younger folks that I talk to, they say, they want to be the CEO of a company or something, and I think that's a great long-term goal.
Yeah.
It's not for everybody, by the way, but there have to be some steps and milestones along the way for most of us.
Hmm.
I mean, some people, yeah, maybe they'll start the next, company and be the CEO or whatever at 26. But for
Right.
most of us, practically speaking,
Hmm.
there's a trajectory and there's steps along the way. And I think just
Hmm.
thinking through like, what are those steps and how to plan through that? And how do you set yourself up to
Hmm.
go sort of step by step,
Yeah.
I think is also important. And that obviously it includes maybe some risk taking, and things like that. And hopefully it includes doing something you enjoy. But I think this thoughtful planning is maybe that sort of third leg of the stool that I would really encourage people in addition to the pursuing something you really love and the risk taking.
I love it. Great stuff here with James Rhyu, the CEO of Stride Education. As we conclude here, folks heading back to the rest of their lives, any final thoughts, takeaways, closing remarks for folks?
The one last thing I would maybe remind or try to hit on with everybody is, especially in K through 12 education, let's really encourage all of us to think about the customer and without getting too political. And I don't want to ruffle too many feathers, but I've learned education is a very politicized industry. And I think for the sake of our kids, it's better to depoliticize it as much as possible,
Hmm.
and really focus on what's best for our kids and our families, and maybe put aside some political differences because this is the future of our country we're talking about. These are our kids. And I think when you put politics into that mix, sometimes it takes the focus off of what's most important, which is the kids.
Great stuff here with James Rhyu, CEO of Stride Education. James, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thanks for having me, Michael. Appreciate it.
And for our listeners, if you liked what you heard, please subscribe, write us a review, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.